Hi, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm super excited for this talk. As per usual, I'm going to let our presenter introduce herself because she'll be better at it than I am. We are going to hear about a really cool project that's just finished data collection called the Luna Project, which Carla will tell us a little bit more about. We, as usual, will have a letter of attendance if you need it for hours, and I've put my information in the chat if you do need that. So I'm happy to send you that letter to confirm your attendance. And if you wouldn't mind during the talk, we'll just turn videos off, we'll stay muted. If you have any questions that arise, pop them in the chat. If you have any issues with Zoom or anything, you can contact Manasuita or myself and we'll try and kind of sort that out. But Carla saved some time at the end for questions. So we're expecting about a 40-minute chat and then we'll have some questions. So without further ado, I will mute myself and turn it over to Carla.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. So I'm excited to be here today and to share my study with you. As Bree said, I'm going to leave about 15 minutes at the end of my presentation for questions, and always feel free to email me afterwards as well. So in today's talk, I'm first going to give an overview of my study, starting with an intro, methods, results, and conclusion. And I've also included some reflections at the end about how it felt to be an assessor for this project, what it was like analysing discourse, and how it has changed me as a speech and language therapist. Just a bit of housekeeping as well. So you're more than welcome to photograph almost every slide from my presentation today, tweet them, share them on other social media, but please don't post any Luna data or my results anywhere on social media, anywhere in a public setting, as we're hoping to publish these. Okay, so this is quite a full-on title. Let me unpack it for you. Okay, so there are several types of reliability, and I focused on three. So intra-rater reliability, inter-rater reliability, and test-retest reliability. And I've explored these three types of reliability using two discourse measures in the personal narratives of people with aphasia. Now, reliability allows us to consider to what extent measurements can be replicated. We want a stable baseline before therapy so that we can quantify how much the behaviour we're looking at varies naturally and what the margin of error is for the measure that we're using. Then we can more confidently say what real change would look like, because we're taking into account chance and measurement error and other sources of variation. So intra-rater reliability is when the same rater reanalyzes the data after a set time to compare the results. Did that rater mark it in the same way? Inter-rater is when two or more different raters analyze the same data and compare results. Are different raters interpreting and applying those objective rules of the measure in the same way? And finally, test-retest reliability is when we test and retest participants after a set time when we don't expect conditions to have changed. So that's usually within a week or so without any intervening therapy. Before I go any further, there are lots of people that I need to thank and that I couldn't have done this project without. So this study was part of a larger Luna feasibility trial funded by the Stroke Association. Dr. Madeline Cruz and Dr. Lucy Dipper are leading the Luna project and were also my supervisors. Lynn Cockayne is my colleague and fellow assessor who collected and analysed half of the data. We're both qualified speech and language therapists, and we both had about 18 months of experience working with people with aphasia. We also had 26 speech and language therapy students who helped us to transcribe the video recordings. And finally, my biggest thank you goes to the 28 participants who generously shared their stories with us. Okay, so for the past year or so, I've been wearing two hats. I've been working as an assessor for Luna, and I've also been doing a master's using data from Luna's double baseline before treatment. So I've been really grounded and close to this data for over a year now, collecting it and crunching it. Okay, so the key takeaways that I would like you to take from today's talk. Reliability matters. When we read papers, when we take a look at methods, we need to be looking to see if they've reported reliability. If reliability is missing or if it's patchy, we need to be more cautious about how we hold the findings from their study. Don't forget about intra-rater reliability. I'm really rooting for this one because it's underreported, but I think it's the bedrock of the other reliability analyses. The third one here is for researchers in the room, and this won't be a surprise, and I know it's something that the Focus Aphasia group are really passionate about too. It's vital in protecting evidence against bias and overinflation of results so that we can be really confident in studies' findings. The last one, so we did see in my study a difference in the test-retest reliability at the word level and the macro structure level. For words, the word level is very reliable, and at the macro structure level it was unreliable. And this really makes us curious about what could be going on here. Okay, so I followed Dipper et al. And defined discourse as encompassing both form and content. So it's connected speech beyond a sentence that is used for a purpose. Studies have shown that people with aphasia alter their discourse for different tasks, for example, procedural, narrative, or description. That is, there's a genre effect. And this is why my study sticks to one genre, personal narratives. Now, the first systematic review on aphasia spoken discourse treatments by Dipper et al. Showed that despite limitations in the evidence base, there are clear signs that discourse treatment works. And it works at multiple levels of language too, at the word, sentence, and macrostructure levels. But a recent UK-wide study by Cruz et al. Found that clinicians felt they lacked the time, knowledge, and confidence to actually be doing discourse analysis. So to develop the field of assessing and treating discourse, we need to overcome these barriers and pursue time-efficient measures. So what's wrong? Coming back to research, it's fair to say that the evidence base is not as strong as it could be. Unbelievably, there are over 500 different outcome measures, 500 for discourse out there, and they exist in different forms. So for something like correct information units or CIUs, you can have number of CIUs, percentage CIUs, or CIUs per minute. Many studies don't report on reliability or other psychometric properties, which mean they don't know how much chance or measurement error or day-to-day variability is playing a role in the changing of scores. And this would undermine any claims that assert that the treatment was responsible for the change. We just can't be confident without first knowing the level of variation before treatment. Where there is reliability data, reporting is often incomplete, which makes replicating studies and comparing studies for meta-analyses incredibly difficult. And if things don't improve, we might be stuck with many small studies and no clear direction on which approach is best. So what's needed to fix this? Well, we need to report on the psychometric properties of discourse measures. We also need to adequately describe our methods with statistical calculations so we can be sure that findings are robust. For example, to measure inter-rater reliability, we need to be using intra-class correlation coefficients, or ICCs, instead of percentage agreement, because percentage agreement isn't statistical and it's inadequate. We need clear reporting standards to help us evaluate study designs, and something I know that Focus Aphasia is working on. We need to link discourse measures to a theoretical framework, so we know what we're measuring and we're not conflating constructs. And these will all help to move the field forwards with evidence-based guidance. So although other studies do elicit narrative, these tend to be structured samples, either about Cinderella or in response to a question like, what did you do at the weekend? In a bid to save time and effort and even remove the need for transcription, some researchers have also used picture stimuli and marked online with predetermined checklists. But personal narratives are more relevant and less artificial, and I would argue have more ecological validity to everyday communication than these structured samples. Okay, so I have been really picky with statistics because they make such a big difference on how we view the data. And I've made a point of choosing the most stringent methods in my study so that we can be confident that we're not overestimating reliability or smoothing over our results. When it comes to reliability, it's often true that both consistency and agreement are important. So here's an example. We can see here that rated B always gives participants 2 more marks than rated A. If we use Pearson's correlation coefficients, which have often been used to evaluate inter-rater reliability, we find a perfect correlation of 1, because Pearson's is interested in consistency, but not agreement. When you instead look at a 2-way mixed ICC with absolute agreement, we see much lower values for reliability, so 0.614 for the reliability estimate. And when we look at the confidence intervals as well, we've got a very lower bound, 0.002. And that's because it's taking into account agreement and the fact that raters never actually agreed. So when you're reading studies, always bear in mind if they've used Pearson's, that represents the maximum limit of what an ICC could be. Okay, so I followed Kuh and Lee's guidance and I've listed some of their key recommendations here. Importantly, I've used 95% confidence intervals, not the estimate alone, because this is crucial in not overestimating reliability. And we take the lower interval as the basis of our interpretation. Okay, so I followed Portney and Watkins guidelines, also recommended by Kuh and Lee, but you'll find in the literature Cicchetti's guidelines are really popular. If you compare them here, you'll see that Cicchetti's are lower, they've got lower thresholds and they're more generous. Okay. You'll also see in studies based on Fitzpatrick's guidelines that ICCs over 0.7 are deemed suitable for groups, and ICCs over 0.9, that's when a measure is deemed suitable for individuals. Okay, so we'll come back to this diagram again. So starting with the least reported type of reliability, intra-rater reliability. So checking the same rater, comparing their analysis and reanalysis. When we come to the time element of this, unfortunately, there's little guidance in the literature. So we just decided that we would reanalyze between 1 and 3 months after initial analysis. For inter-rater reliability, we compared the scores between Lynn and I, analysing the same stories. And test-retest, comparing how participants performed at test and retest after a set time when we didn't expect a change. The guidance for the gap between test and retest is 2 to 14 days, again, according to Fitzpatrick. So we aimed for our time points to be about a week apart. And you can see that the focus on what's being investigated is different too. So for these, it's the rater's behaviour, and for here, test retest, it's more about the participants' behaviour. There may be other known and unknown sources of variability too, which may affect stability, such as the assessment procedure. And that's why I'm careful not to use stability as a synonym for test-retest reliability. So all types of reliability are important, but also argue that they need to be addressed in order. So if we can't establish good and excellent intra-rater reliability, then the other two are meaningless. We really need the green light from intra-rater before we can go ahead. Inter-rater reliability must be established to check that different raters are doing the same thing with the measure. If it's good enough, then we can pool the different groups potentially for test-retest. And I'll talk about this a bit more later. Okay, so to recap, my study involved investigating 3 types of reliability in the personal narratives of 28 participants post-stroke with mild to moderate aphasia. It's a double baseline pre-treatment with 2 time points. And in fact, those time points were on average 8 days apart, ranging from 4 to 14 days. Something to note here as well, our participants each told 2 personal narratives at each time point. So in total, there were 112 narratives, which is a lot. And therefore, Lynn and I collected and analysed half each. So 14 participants each, 56 narratives each. It's often not feasible for all raters to analyse all samples in studies, so caseload is divided, which makes the good reporting of inter-rater reliability even more important. Okay, so it might not come as a surprise that we had to conduct Luna online because of the pandemic. Participants were given videos and presentations before and at the beginning of assessment sessions to orientate them to the task. You can see that we were looking for meaningful stories about their experiences, but we also steered them away from some things, including stories about their stroke or aphasia. These stories are fundamentally important, and they're often shared with family and friends and new people. But the Luna team made the decision to focus on other aspects of life, other important stories that people found meaningful and were happy to work on in therapy. Okay, so we also provided some guidance on topics, but participants were free to choose what they wanted. Talking about holidays is really popular, as was talking about achievements at school, in sport, in their careers. We also had people talking about hobbies, so belly dancing, cycling, playing instruments, and a few stories about significant life events as well, so meeting their partner or a big birthday. Okay, so both personal narratives were elicited at the start of sessions, and then we reversed the order at time point 2 to avoid order effect. Participants could use props, so pictures or objects such as a trophy, if they wished, and were allowed to write in the moment to facilitate speech production, but no writing was allowed in preparation, and they weren't allowed to read from notes. Participants weren't informed of a time limit, but timekeeping was down to assessors. In the rare instance that a participant was still talking after 15 minutes, the assessor would give a 1-minute warning at a natural pause so as to avoid interrupting, and then would not intervene further. Assessors were instructed to be friendly and attentive listeners, but we were not to provide many verbal responses. Assessors also checked that participants were finished by saying, "Is there anything more that you'd like to add to your story?" As assessors, we monitored for fatigue, and we would offer a 10-minute break between stories as needed, which worked really well. So as I said, we had 26 SLT students who took turns to transcribe and check the video recordings of our participants telling their stories. The majority were volunteers, but I think there were 4 who were doing their placement as well. Assessors would then check those transcripts for their participants, and any edits made by assessors were considered final. And there has been some preliminary work on the inter-rater reliability of this transcribing. I think it was 85% for a small proportion of the data. And when it came to the assessors doing their intra and inter-rater reliability analyses, assessors did not retranscribe, but we used the final version of the transcript. So we were just redoing the analysis. Okay, so here is a diagram of all the analyses that we're currently doing in the wider LUNA project. And my study looked at 2, so I was looking at percentage narrative words and the number of story grammar elements present. Okay, and here are the procedures that we followed. So for narrative words, based on Safran et al., we first prepared total words. As you can see, there's really a handful of rules here for selecting narrative words, and then percentage narrative words was just the percentage of narrative words out of total words. If you think about CIUs, which is a similar word level language, that has pages and pages in its protocol in Nicholas and Brookshire et al. Nicholas and Brookshire 1993, just in comparison. From macrostructure level measure, story grammar, based on Labov, and you can find some really good descriptions of story grammar from Whitworth. So we used our narrative word transcript, divided it into sections. Here we go. So I've got a little diagram at the top. So we have 3 sections. So divide it into beginning, middle and end, and each of these sections has elements that belong to it. And so we would divide it up and then identify whether each story grammar element was present in the appropriate section. And it also had to be clear. And if it was, then we'd score 1 point. If it wasn't there or was unclear, it scored 0. So this was an integer scale from 0 to 9. We were only scoring if it was present, so we didn't give extra credit for multiple occurrences. The multiple occurrences is something that Whitworth et al. Did, and they were also a bit less stringent on where the elements appeared. So, you know, they would mark maybe participants in this section, which we wouldn't do. Okay, so here are the reasons that I chose these measures. They represent different levels of language, and they're measuring different things, so they're not conflating constructs. And there's also gaps in the reliability data. So Safran et al. Didn't provide us with intra or test-retest data. Pritchard et al. Didn't provide us with test-retest data. It's really important to note here that, you know, these studies, percentage CIUs and story grammar, they collapsed different discourse samples together. So we have to be cautious when we're comparing reliability results from their mixed genre studies to our single genre study. And finally, you know, both percentage narrative words and story grammar, the way that we're doing it, we're deemed to be relatively quick to do. Okay, so here are my research questions. So Lynn and I are the 2 assessors, but I'm not going to reveal who is who. Okay, so looking first at the intra-rater reliability of each of us. So 6 out of 56, just over 10% of our sample. Once that was established and we got the green light, then we'd go on to inter-rater reliability. 12 out of 112, so again, just over 10%. And we decided before that if inter-rater reliability, if the estimate was over 0.75, then we would pool participants together into one group to look at test-retest. If it was less, then we would keep the groups separate to avoid conflating an unacceptably high level of rater effect into the test-retest analysis. You can see for test-retest 2 that I analysed personal narrative 1 and 2 separately. This is because in reliability analyses, it's important that every entity should be independent of all other entities, and that wouldn't have been the case if we had put them all in the same pot. I also wanted to look at the average performances at time point 1 and time point 2 for group reliability to see how it affected the test-retest reliability. The genre is the same, it's personal narratives, and we suspected that people would largely have the same style of storytelling for topics that were familiar to them. Okay. So because ICCs can be hard to interpret because they are looking at the group level, I followed Boyle in her 2014 paper where she calculated the standard error of measurement, or SEM, and the minimal detectable change, or MDC, which can be used to inform decision making for individuals. The SEM provides an estimate of the likely range of true scores, quantifying measurement error when we repeat measures for individuals. The MDC estimates the smallest change in an individual score to indicate real change in the behaviour being measured over and above variation from measurement error. So it's really useful actually when judging the efficacy of any treatments. So less reliable measures will have larger SEMs and larger MDCs, and more reliable measures will have smaller SEMs and smaller MDCs. Okay, so here's an example. I've changed the names, so don't worry. So I've removed linguistic fillers like OK and R. I've removed neologisms like kitse. I've removed many repetitions like T. I've removed partial words like I, and I've removed some extra narrative content here. No, yeah, that was in relation to the question, anything else to add? Okay, so now you've seen an example. Here are the results for percentage narrative words. So on the left-hand side here, you can see the guidelines that I've used to interpret the results. Clearly, we're rooting for dark green, but you know, light green is okay too. They represent good and excellent reliability. So first, let's have a look at intra-rater, looking at how raters compared to themselves. These are the best findings we could find, we could hope for. You see the ICC estimate here is almost perfect, it's almost 1. And remember, we need to come over to this column because we're being stringent and we're paying attention to the 95% confidence intervals so that we can be supremely confident that we're not overestimating reliability. So, got the green light to go ahead. Now looking at how raters compare to each other, we see that it's still green across the board and approaching excellent. And remember, all of these include absolute agreement, and so these are really terrific findings. So if we take a look at test-retest, we see story 1, it's good, good to excellent, excellent for story 2, good to excellent reliability for test-retest. And if we come over now to this last column, the MDC, the amount that would be needed to show real change, we see that looking at the average performance of participants at each time point, the MDC becomes lower. So it becomes 15.96. Now let's say, we'll just round it up for ease to 16. So that means that we need an uplift of 16% of narrative words, so more narrative words out of their total words, in a participant story next time, to be able to say that there was real change, a real improvement in their performance. Now here are the results for story grammar. Sorry, before we go to the results, here is an example of story grammar. So you can see this assessor has color coded the beginning, the middle and the end, and you can see that they've coded things that are unclear, things that are absent, and they've awarded points. So this person scored 3 out of 9. Okay. So here are the results for story grammar. And remember, in our study, it's an integer count on the scale between 0 to 9. So looking at intra-rater again, we see excellent reliability for assessor A, good to excellent confidence intervals, excellent for assessor B, excellent confidence intervals. So we have the green light to go forwards. Brilliant. Okay, now we go to looking at how raters compare to each other. Not so good. So we see that there was moderate reliability, but we're being stringent, so we look over to the lower bound here, and it's poor. Okay, so raters were not in agreement with each other. So based on these results, we kept the group separate for our test retest analyses. So we've got the test retest scores for group A and the test retest scores for group B. Now, again, you look at the test retest scores and it's not green again across the board this time. Remember, test retest looks at how consistently participants told the same story across a week. We have now protected it against that low inter-rater reliability because we've kept the group separate. So we can see here that the way people are telling their stories is different, okay? And each group had a story that was particularly unreliable. So for group A, it was personal narrative 1, low to excellent. And for group B, the less reliable story was actually story 2. Again, this is poor to excellent. When I dug a little bit deeper, and I found that there were outliers behind these lower reliability scores. So I removed 1 person from group A for that story and 2 people from group B for that story. And we can see that the reliability has improved a bit, goes up to moderate to excellent, and for group B it improves a bit more, so good to excellent. If we have a look at that last column again, we can see that the MDC has improved a bit as well when we take out those outliers. So because it's an integer scale, we need to round up to 3, and so there would need to be a change of 3 to show real change. Now, when we have a maximum score of 9, that means that some participants who score quite high at baseline, 7, 8, 9, they wouldn't be able to show meaningful change. So we're hitting the ceiling here. Okay, so digging a bit deeper behind poor inter-rater reliability for story grammar, we found a few differences between the approaches that assessors have taken, and they agreed 50% of the time. When they disagreed, they were 1 or 2 marks apart, but they were 4 marks apart. So they presented them differently. One assessor color-coded, whereas the other didn't, and that sometimes led to differences of opinion of whether it was in the right section. One assessor collated different utterances together using ellipsis, whereas the other assessor would pluck an example down into the evidence. So that assessor that was kind of gathering different evidence, they might have been employing a bit of cohesion there and might have increased the likelihood of giving credit. Assessors often did choose the same sorts of things as evidence for different elements, but there was some differences of opinion in the coda and the evaluation elements. And finally, I mean, most of the disagreements between assessors were about whether the element was clear enough to be counted. Okay, and all of the disagreements here actually could have been avoided with more explicit instructions and further training. Okay, so we are the first study like this to do this with personal narratives. We found that our word level measure, percentage narrative words, was reliable, and it compares favourably to percentage CIUs in studies with other genres. CIUs has more rules, and so it'd be really interesting for us as a Luna team to analyse the time taken to do percentage narrative words versus percentage CIUs, and also to measure the reliability of percentage CIUs from the Luna study. Although you might say that we got mixed results from macrostructure measure, story grammar, it is reinforcing research that says this macrostructure measure can be well repeated by the same assessor, and that the differences found between our raters, I mean, there is an easy fix, I think, for us to get good inter-rater reliability here, just by tightening up the guidelines and by counting in a different way to avoid that ceiling effect. When it comes to test-retest results, this is where it gets interesting. So I think the issue here is not that people are telling their stories differently. We value flexibility in language. We don't want people to memorize their stories or to tell them robotically. That would be so boring for both the speaker and the listener. But we do need to find a reliable measure that tracks how people are structuring their stories. So I don't want you to go away thinking that story grammar is bad or it's useless, but in its current form here, it doesn't work to measure baseline ability, and it wouldn't work to measure responsiveness to therapy because of that ceiling. Sorry, just lost my train of thought. Here we go. So when it comes to test-retest results, it's actually something that I think we should find is something interesting, and it's something that Luna will look into. It might be demonstrating agency that our participants have over their language, that they're moving elements around, they're selecting different things to talk about, their stories are dynamic and flexible, and the challenge for us now is to find an appropriate measure. Okay. Very briefly, I know time is slipping away, I've got a few minutes. Okay, so a few reflections as an assessor. I was very concerned with it feeling uncomfortable because it was online, it was monologues, couldn't step in to help if someone was struggling, but actually it turned out to be a really enjoyable experience. We had spent plenty of time getting to know participants to make them feel comfortable with us, the technology, the procedure, and I think that really paid off. And they also had over 2 weeks, I think, to think of stories. As they shared their stories, it was really nice to see participants become really animated and enthusiastic. And of course, this task was more difficult for some participants, but I felt like it was something that people really were willing to persevere in, and they wanted to keep going and to share their stories. Okay, as an analyst, it was challenging to learn so many new analyses. Luckily, we had regular meetings with Lucy as Lucy Dipper, an experienced linguist, to discuss issues and come to agreements, which sometimes meant going back and tweaking things. With lots of practice, though, we've been able to internalise the rules, and now we're much faster at analysing. And I think that we've shown that collecting and transcribing and manually analysing personal narratives is possible. And I found it really interesting actually to look at stories from different angles. And surprisingly, story grammar was one of the hardest, despite looking like one of the easiest. And I had to keep reminding myself to mark what was on the page and not what I had understood reading between the lines. Finally, reflections as a speech and language therapist. Before, when it came to collecting discourse in my job, I used to be head down, writing as fast as I possibly could. And I noticed that, you know, for Luna, when it was being recorded, it really took the pressure off me, but it also, eye contact with the speaker was so important. I felt like through analysing people's discourse, it keeps the focus on them and not on the dyad dynamic, and highlights the difference between describing and often compensatory strategies to actually understanding their language deeply and being able to target impairments directly. I think as listeners that we actually do a lot of work unconsciously to fill in gaps and to tune into people. And some stories actually didn't sound all that atypical at the time, but when I was analysing story grammar or reference change, for example, that's when I realised that there were quite a lot of ambiguities. You know, what did that it mean? I'm not sure now. Okay. Here is a list of the key papers that I've referenced today. And I also just wanted to point out to any clinicians on the call, there's some free Luna resources on the Cara Hub, which can help you to put into practice assessing and treating discourse, and that's based on findings from Luna's survey and systematic review that came out last year. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm going to stop sharing there, and I'm happy to try and answer any questions that you may have.
Awesome. We have one already in the chat who's actually from my lab, but I thought I might kick it off and then I'll read hers after, and then we'll open it up to give people a little bit more time to write their questions in the chat or prepare them to be unmuted. We were chatting yesterday. We have about 5 people working at various levels on looking at discourse, and in every sample of people with aphasia that we collect, there are always individuals who are just really difficult to transcribe and code. They're either really verbose, they have a lot of neologisms, there's just something about their speech that's really difficult. And when we were thinking about randomly doing reliability, it seemed to me that maybe we missed a chance to look at those more difficult to code people. And, you know, we were kind of thinking, like, would semi-random reliability be a bit more, I don't want to say accurate, but I'm going to say accurate for lack of a better word, to really make sure you're including some of those individuals who might be driving like reliability issues. What do you think about that?
We did, I mean, it wasn't their main problem, but we did have some participants that had, you know, a praxis of speech on top. And so you might have noticed in the narrative words example I shared, we did allow some neologisms that were intelligible in context to count as narrative words. So sure. Beautiful would count. So we were trying to be fair in terms of thinking about intelligibility in context. I know that's something similar to CIUs. I'm not quite sure if I've understood the question about semi-random.
Yeah, so if you have someone who's just really, like there's always at least one person who's just speech is very difficult to code. You know, and to me, I want to make sure that we are reliably coding that person. So I want to include them in the reliability sample, but then that makes it non-random, right? So I guess I was just thinking out loud as to whether that defeats the purpose of having kind of random selection. I see Lucy's thinking face.
I'm thinking it's about the difference between random sampling. So our 10% was across all participants.
Yeah.
So we got them all, whereas other ways of random sampling would be to select 10%, and it was a random sample of participants. So we did take everybody, which enabled Carla then to look for outliers.
Yeah, it's a difficult choice, I feel like, depending on how much woman power you have.
So when Carla looked at outliers, what she found was so she also looked at things like verbosity and fluency and severity, and none of those things skewed the reliability. So the outlier that she took out was just one person, and it wasn't that he had a particular profile. He or she had a particular profile. So it was informative to do that.
Yeah, that's super interesting. We recently did that, and it was a neurotypical individual who was the outlier.
Always.
Yeah, but Julianne, who's a PhD student in my lab, I'll just read hers out here. So we were thinking of how to analyze personal narratives, similar to what your prompt was, with percent CIUs, so correct information units. But our lab members had a difficulty deciding if certain phrases or words were relevant in context. It was really difficult to decide extra narrative content. Did you find that also? Yeah, okay.
I think what was really encouraging, though, was the findings that we had. So it was something that me and Lynn talked about. We were like, oh, what do you think? What do you think? I think the regular checking back with each other was really helpful. But actually, when we got the results, I think we were pleasantly surprised that the reliability was so high. So I feel like, I think you kind of get into the groove with it, and you start to kind of anticipate, and especially with it being recorded, we could sometimes refer back to the video and just, by the tone, just to see like, oh, were they talking about their story then, or were they talking about something else? And that was very helpful.
I think you bring up a good point about training too, and just the amount of training and exposure that goes into becoming good raters is not to be underestimated. So I think you make a good point there. On that note, I'm going to stop talking. So if anyone else would like to ask Carla any questions, or pop them in the chat and we can read them off.
While we wait for questions, I just had more of a comment than a question, but I do agree completely with you, Carla, in the sense that the measures that we are selecting are very important. And we did reliability for microlinguistic and macrolinguistic data. And it was, we used the story retell. It was a quite novel task. And we found the same thing. I had many more issues with reliability. Sorry about the sirens. I'm in Chicago, so. But yeah, we had a lot of disagreements for the macrolinguistic measures. I used Andrea Marini's ratings for that, and it was the same thing where microlinguistic was more quantitative and it was easy to come to terms with, but macrolinguistic was more of a vague area.
We kind of changed our approach, because initially we were kind of going through all the analyses one by one on the same story, and by the time we came to story grammar, I think we were so over familiar with the story that we were just kind of adding all this meaning on top. So actually we started to chunk the stories, and that actually really helped in terms of stopping cross-fertilization between, CIUs and narrative words as well, which sometimes are a bit too similar. So we needed to kind of separate them out and just go through all of the stories with one analysis, all of the stories with another analysis. But yeah, definitely hard, and had to keep kind of coming back and saying, what's on the page? What did they say? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Let's see if anyone has any other ones. I was just thinking out loud as you were rating. Did you have any thoughts about other measures that you thought might capture some really interesting stuff as you were going? I mean, I know you had all decided as a team to kind of look at the two measures you talked about here, but just using your kind of therapist background, did you get any feelings about other measures that maybe might have been pretty good to look at?
I can be really honest here. So I was really hoping to get PASS, predicate argument structure as well, so that we, for this master's measures study, so that we could have a measure at every level, but it just wasn't possible in terms of timing, and PASS has been a particularly tricky analysis to get our head around, because we've just had such amazingly complex language. I think, Lucy, you said several times it's far exceeded our expectations of what participants might produce. So it's been quite tricky to kind of get our heads around. Sometimes it's like 7 lines to parse. So yeah, I mean, that's hopefully something in the future that we can we can add in. I think it would be really really beneficial to see how they interrelate as well.
Yeah, definitely. See if there's any other questions.
Can I might have a couple of thoughts on your methods that maybe might be worth stewing on a little bit. And I don't know that I know the answer to these, but there are just 2 things I was, sorry for the barking. My first thought is that, you know, ICC is typically intended for continuous variables, right? Continuous scales. And story grammar, if I recall right, is this kind of ordinal interval scale. And so I wonder whether, you know, the ICC like truly works for that scale. I suppose perhaps the 9-point scale is close enough, but that might be something to think about. And my other thought sort of related to this is that, you know, that 95% confidence interval, right, is tied to the sample size. And because the, I believe, inter-rater reliability for story grammar was not acceptable, and so you split the groups for test retest, your lower bound on that confidence interval, right, is in fact lower than you might expect if you were able to combine the groups. And so maybe this gets at your idea that if you can tighten up those guidelines for story grammar, just by the fact that then you can pool raters, right, you will have a better lower bound on that 95% confidence interval. So I don't really know that, like, I'm curious your thoughts on this and how you might go about, you know, kind of following these kinds of like methodological concerns. I think you said you were writing up your paper, but anyways.
Thank you so much. Those are really thought-provoking comments, and I think we would need to use a different counting method, purely because of the ceiling effect as well. So I think we might try counting like Whitworth et al. Does, so counting every occurrence of a story grammar element after splitting a transcript into utterances, so that we would have much bigger numbers, so we wouldn't have that scale of 0 to 9. So that might help with that problem of using ICCs. But absolutely, I think the bigger the sample size, the better. Thank you.
Rob, does that mean you still have hope for story grammar being an appropriate measure for detecting change?
I think, sure, right? I mean, I guess I maybe wasn't as pessimistic about the lower tail of that 95% confidence interval because the sample size was cut in half. Like it's just hard to compare that to, you know, the sample size of 56, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm curious about this in general, and this is one thing I struggle a lot with in thinking about outcome measures or, you know, any measurement of discourses. Whenever we have a ceiling, the measure immediately becomes like almost inappropriate for a subset of participants, right? Like complete utterances is maybe a great example of that, where if, you know, 30% of your like in some treatment study, 30% of participants are near 100% complete utterances. Like that's not a helpful outcome measure for 30% of people. And, you know, if you don't see change, you know, is it because the outcome measure wasn't appropriate? So I think that is a story grammar concern. It's anything with these ceilings. I don't know how to deal with it. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, just in our experience, anything with ceilings or anything that doesn't have a true anchoring middle point, we've had a lot of issues with in terms of reliability. So like, you know, these story grammars don't have an anchoring middle point, right? It's just categories. And as Manasuita was mentioning, her study, I mean, with cohesion, you've got a 1 to 4, but again, there's like no anchoring middle point. You have no like way to really look at how often people are choosing that middle, or how often, I'm thinking, you know, just looking at bias in any way, right? You can't really tell that well with these types of measures. So, I mean, I think your thoughts are warranted, but I don't know, but I love the idea of looking at macro structure, because I think we're missing a lot when we just focus on the micro, but the benefit of the micro is there's no ceiling. Well, for most. Let's see any other chat questions coming. Well, I will ask Carla if she would like to. I will include her email somewhere if people have follow-up questions. And this will be posted probably tomorrow on our YouTube channel, and it will live there for however long we want. And maybe we'll invite her back and Lynn back as well to tell us a little bit more about future work in Luna as well. So thanks all for joining us today. I think we had about 20 participants at its peak, which is awesome in the middle of summer. So kudos to everyone joining us, or winter if you're from the other hemisphere. And I will see you all at our next event. We'll probably kick back again in September. We already have a few speakers lined up. So just check our website in a few weeks and you'll see those show up. Thanks all for coming. If you need a letter, just send me an email. Thanks, Cara. Bye all.
Bye.